On the 9th of November 2015, at around 9 a.m., a squirrel hunter was making his way through the Talladega Forest in Alabama when he came across a truly gruesome scene. He found the remains of a naked woman that had been tied to a tree with barbed wire. Her throat had been slashed open, and upon closer inspection, he realized her head had been separated from her body, and it also appeared that this woman had been brutally tortured in the moments leading up to her death. This case begins on the 30th of October, 2015. A 29-year-old woman named Samantha Payne began to get ready for a Halloween party that night. Samantha was known to be a hard worker, as she worked 7 days a week to pay her own college fees, and she was described as a very generous person who was always happy to help. Although she could be a little naive and a little too trusting, she had a tendency to only see the good in people and almost completely disregard the bad. The 30th of October was also her birthday. She was heading out to celebrate with her friends, who had even gotten her a costume for the party. She was going as Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz, and she had a quick chat to her mother, and she was worried that she looked stupid. She said, "Do you really think he's nice? Or are they trying to be mean to me?" Her mother gave her some reassurance, and she went on her way to the party. Tragically, it would be the last conversation she would ever have with her daughter again. Samantha went to the party, but she never returned home. Samantha was friends with some rather unsavory characters. She met with a group of people named Michael Belcher, who was 31, a girl named Chili Bruce, who was 18, Alicia Watson, who was 22, and two brothers, Marcus and Stephen George, aged 32 and 30. The night of the 2nd of November, the group began to shoot up meth at a place called Wee Rating in Centreville, which was Michael's place of work. At some point while they were high on meth, some of the group took her car keys and drove in her car. Stephen had decided to concoct a plan of stealing the catalytic converter and the battery from Samantha's car. He managed to steal the car keys out of her purse while she left the room for a moment. He then drove the car out to a location where he removed the converter and the battery from the car. He then punctured the fuel tank and set it on fire. After some time passed, Samantha had noticed that her car was missing. She was understandably very upset and angry that her so-called friends would do this to her. She accused the other people of stealing her car and told them to simply return it, or that she would contact the police. Once hearing the threats of the police, and knowing that her car could never be returned, Michael feared that if she did indeed call the police, that they would discover all the meth, and that they would be arrested for that too. So Michael grabbed Samantha, threw her to the ground, and began to punch, kick, and stomp her. After she was badly beaten, the group drove around to several locations with Samantha in the trunk of Michael's car. She was in there for quite a few hours. The gang then took her to Michael's house. And this is when the case becomes extremely sinister and twisted. They forced her to strip naked. They then bound her hands and feet, and they began to mercilessly beat her for hours again. Michael then stated that they had to end her life now. So, they put her back in the trunk of Michael's car and drove her out to the Talladega National Forest. At a point in the journey, Samantha managed to briefly escape, but unfortunately, they noticed. They stopped, dragged her back to the car, and stuffed her in a boot again. They arrived at the forest, and she was tied to the tree, where she would later be found by the hunters. Samantha begged them to stop, and told them that she loved them, and that if they stopped now, she would never tell a soul what happened that night. The gang heard her bargaining pleas and requests, but instead, they chose to amp up the torture. The two women, Alyssa and Chili, took a knife. They pushed the knife underneath each and every fingernail and ripped them off one by one. And when they finished, they then plunged the knife under her toenails, and one by one, they removed those too. And while the women were doing this to Samantha, she never stopped telling them that she loved them, and continued to beg them to stop. And if all this wasn't enough, they then took a pair of pliers and began to rip several teeth from her mouth. The pain and fear that she must have experienced is truly incomprehensible. The group watched on as Michael began to cut Samantha's body with a knife. Alyssa also pistol whipped her in the head too. After the hours and hours of brutal torture, Michael walked forward with the knife and began to slice at her throat. They then left her dead in the forest. After the hunter reported that a body had been discovered in the forest, a police officer heard this and called the investigators right away and told them that he had recently arrested a couple just near that area. He noticed them because they were completely covered in blood. He searched them both, and he found meth, so he arrested them. This couple was Stephen George and the 18-year-old Chili Bruce. I'm unsure as to why the officer never looked further into the fact that they were both covered in blood. But, upon receiving this information, the investigators questioned Stephen and Chili and asked them about Samantha Payne, and if they knew anything about it, or if they had any involvement. They both confessed and said that Michael was the ringleader and was responsible for the murder. They told them that Michael Belcher was the one who cut her throat. Chili, Stephen, and Michael were all charged with murder soon afterward. Michael's home and car was searched, and evidence was found that matched up with what Chili had told the detective. They found Samantha's clothes inside his car, and her car battery inside Michael's home. Chili Bruce and Stephen George were allowed to plead guilty to a lesser charge in exchange for testifying against Michael. Michael said he was willing to plead guilty if he got the same deal as Stephen. But thankfully, that was refused. Alyssa Watson and Marcus George were later charged with first-degree kidnapping instead of capital murder. Marcus and Alyssa were both charged later on too. At first, Michael tried to deny the murder. But then, the investigators told him that they had found the body, and that his friends had already testified against him. He spoke to his mother, who told him to be honest. Michael then asked her to look after his cat while he was in jail. A doctor named Stephen Dunton performed an autopsy on Samantha soon after her body was found. He struggled to piece together exactly what had happened to her, due to the advanced state of decomposition, and because the majority of her internal organs had been pulled from her body. I was unable to find whether this was due to animals in the forest, or if the gang of five had anything to do with it. The doctor could not determine the exact cause of Payne's death, whether she was killed before or after her throat had been sliced. The only thing he knew for certain was that she had been murdered. Now all we have to go off is the testimonials from the people who carried out this incredibly disturbing and brutal crime. So did they really do all of this because Samantha was going to report them to the police? It just doesn't seem likely to me. Although, they were under the influence of meth, so it could have perhaps altered their state of mind. Michael Belcher said that he was sorry for the events that occurred that night, but I can imagine that apology didn't mean too much. Michael Belcher was sentenced to death after being found guilty of committing capital murder. Marcus George and Alyssa Watson were both sentenced to 30 years in prison, and they both filed appeals. Stephen George will spend the rest of his life in prison, after narrowly avoiding the death sentence. And Chili Bruce was only sentenced to 5 years in jail, followed by 15 years parole. Which means she's probably out right now. In my personal opinion, I do believe that the other people received lenient punishments for their crimes. They had the chance to stop this from escalating further at so many points. Yet instead, they decided to torture this poor woman in such a disturbing way. They listened to her cry and beg, but they continued to hurt her. People such as this should never be allowed back into civilized society. Samantha's mother made a few statements after her death. She said her daughter's killers never saw her light. She said she was really extra special. She had the best personality. She was always smiling, giving people gifts, and telling jokes. She was always seeing the brighter side of things. Her mother also said, "As long as I live, I will never let her be forgotten, and I will tell her story, anywhere and everywhere that I can." But for reasons that are unknown to me, Samantha's mother never reported her missing until around the 9th of November, which is the day she was found.